Hey, Jimmy, you missed a spot on the holographic display in Lecture Hall C. Jimmy O'Brien looked up from his mop bucket, water dripping from the strands in a rhythm that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The purple-scaled Vorthax student, some hotshot from the Outer Rim whose name he'd never bothered to learn, pointed dramatically at a barely visible smudge on the supposedly ultra-advanced holographic projector. Right, Jimmy said, his voice carrying the exact amount of enthusiasm you'd expect from someone who'd been mopping the same halls for 3 years. Because clearly the fate of your xenobiology presentation depends on that microscopic water spot. The student's head frills fluttered, and what Jimmy had learned was either confusion or irritation. Hard to tell with Vorthax, they had about as much emotional range as a broken food processor. Are you being sarcastic, human? Me? Sarcastic? Jimmy dipped his mop back into the bucket with a splash that sent a few drops onto the student's perfectly polished boots. Never. I live to serve the great minds of tomorrow, one spot at a time. See, here's the thing about working as a janitor at the galaxy's most prestigious interspecies academy. Yes, that's actually what they called it on the brochures. Apparently someone in marketing had the creativity of wet cardboard. You learn real quick that 90% of advanced alien civilizations are just as petty and self-important as humans. The only difference is they do it with more tentacles and occasionally in different dimensions. Jimmy had been pushing a mop around the Kepler Station Academy for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting or anything. The job had exactly 3 benefits: decent pay, nobody bothered him much, and he got to listen in on lectures about quantum mechanics and interdimensional warfare from some of the galaxy's supposedly brightest minds. The 4th benefit, watching spoiled alien kids trip over their own superiority complexes, was just a bonus. Your attitude is most peculiar for someone of your station, the Vorthax continued, because apparently he'd missed the memo about when to shut up and move on. Jimmy straightened up, all 6 feet of him unfolding like a piece of furniture someone had been storing in a closet. His janitor's coveralls were standard issue gray, designed by someone who'd apparently never heard of human dignity, or colors that don't make you look like a walking depression commercial. My station? Jimmy raised an eyebrow, a gesture that seemed to universally translate across species as, really, we're doing this now? You mean the job where I make sure you don't have to sit in your own filth while pretending to understand why quarks have flavor? The student's scales shifted from purple to a rather alarming shade of orange. Jimmy had seen this before. This was the color Vorthax turned right before they either threw a tantrum or called security. Sometimes both. I am Zrextal the Magnificent, heir to the Vorthax trading empire, and I will not be spoken to in such a manner by a mere janitor. Yeah, you mentioned. Jimmy resumed mopping, because honestly this conversation had stopped being interesting about 30 seconds ago. Look, your magnificence. I've got about 17 more halls to clean before my shift ends, and standing here listening to your life story isn't making the floors any shinier. Now most janitors, human or otherwise, would probably have backed down at this point. After all, students at the academy came from families that could buy and sell entire star systems before lunch. But Jimmy O'Brien had never been accused of being most janitors. He'd also never been accused of being particularly smart, but that was beside the point. Zrextal's head frills were now standing at full attention, like some kind of organic mohawk. You dare dismiss me? Do you have any idea who I am? Unfortunately, yes. Jimmy paused his mopping to lean on the handle. You're Zrextal the Magnificent, heir to something-something empire, probably 3rd in your xenobiology class. And judging by the way you pronounce quantum entanglement, you're going to be lucky to graduate with honors instead of highest honors, which, let's be honest, is basically a participation trophy at this place. The silence that followed was the kind you usually hear right before someone gets either promoted or fired. Jimmy was betting on fired, but he'd been wrong before. Zrextal's scales had now shifted to a color that Jimmy was pretty sure didn't exist in human vision. How do you know about my grades? Same way I know that Professor Veltar is sleeping with his research assistant, that the dean's been embezzling funds to pay for his addiction to Regelian spice, and that the impenetrable quantum security system has a back door that any first-year hacker could exploit. Jimmy started mopping again, because multitasking was apparently one of his many underappreciated talents. You pick things up when people pretend you're invisible. This was true. Jimmy had discovered that wearing janitor's coveralls was like having a cloaking device, except instead of bending light around you, it bent attention. Students, professors, administrators, they all talked around him like he was a piece of furniture. A particularly ugly piece of furniture that occasionally moved. That's impossible, Zrextal stammered. Our security protocols are designed by the lowest bidder and implemented by people who think password 123 is the height of digital security? Jimmy shrugged. Yeah, I noticed. What Jimmy didn't mention was that he'd spent the last 3 years not just listening to lectures, but actually understanding them. Turns out, when you have a doctorate in theoretical physics and 2 master's degrees in engineering and xenobiology, picking up on academic gossip is like riding a bicycle. A really nerdy, overcomplicated bicycle. But hey, nobody asked about his qualifications when he applied for the janitor position. They just saw human and willing to work for minimum wage and handed him a mop. Zrextal was staring at him now with the kind of expression usually reserved for discovering that your pet had learned to do calculus. You're not just a janitor. Nope, Jimmy said cheerfully. I'm a janitor with opinions, much more dangerous. Before Zrextal could formulate a response, which, given his apparent mental processing speed, might have taken another 10 minutes, a new voice cut through the hallway. Mr. O'Brien? Could I have a word? Jimmy looked up to see Dr. Lyra Blackwood approaching, her heels clicking against the freshly mopped floor with the precise rhythm of someone who'd never worked a day in her life but had somehow become the dean of student affairs anyway. She was human, which was both a relief and a disappointment. Relief because it meant he wouldn't have to navigate another set of alien social protocols. Disappointment because it meant he couldn't blame this conversation on cross-species misunderstanding. Dr. Blackwood, Jimmy nodded, still holding his mop like a staff of office. Let me guess. Someone complained about my customer service? Something like that. She glanced at Zrextal, who was still standing there like a colorful statue. Mr. Zrextal, don't you have a class to attend? The Vorthak's scales flickered between orange and purple, like a confused mood ring. But he said... I'm sure he said many things. Run along. After Zrextal slithered away, literally, Vorthax didn't walk so much as glide in a way that always reminded Jimmy of someone trying to ice skate on carpet. Doctor. Blackwood turned her attention back to him. We need to talk, she said. About my sparkling personality? Because I have to warn you, it's an acquired taste. About the fact that you just demonstrated knowledge of classified information to a student. Her voice had that special quality that administrators developed after years of dealing with problems they couldn't solve by throwing money at them. Information that a janitor shouldn't have access to. Jimmy considered this. On one hand, he probably should have kept his mouth shut. On the other hand, where was the fun in that? Define shouldn't, he said finally. Don't be clever, Mr. O'Brien. It doesn't suit you. Ouch, right in the ego. Jimmy resumed mopping, because standing still felt too much like admitting defeat. So what's this about, Doc? You finally realize that maybe, just maybe, the human janitor isn't quite as stupid as you all assumed. Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a moment, watching him work. Jimmy had learned to read silences. They usually meant someone was trying to figure out how much trouble they were in. How long have you known? She asked finally. Known what? About the security back door. About Professor Veltar. About... She paused. About all of it. Jimmy stopped mopping and looked up at her. Really looked for the first time in 3 years. Dr. Blackwood was younger than most administrators, probably mid-30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that came from having to be twice as good as everyone else, just to get half the respect. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that said professional, but her eyes said, tired of everyone's bullshit. You're not asking because you're worried about security, Jimmy said slowly. You're asking because you already knew about the problems, and now you're wondering what else I know. That's a very astute observation for a janitor. Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises. Jimmy leaned the mop against the wall and gave her his full attention. So, what's really going on here, Doc? Because I'm pretty sure this conversation isn't standard procedure for janitor says sarcastic thing to student. Dr. Blackwood glanced around the hallway, checking for eavesdroppers. When she was satisfied they were alone, she stepped closer and lowered her voice. 3 days ago, someone accessed the Academy's main computer system using credentials that shouldn't exist. They downloaded classified research data, student records, and staff files. The intrusion was sophisticated. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for and how to get it without triggering our security protocols. Sounds like an inside job, Jimmy said, because it seemed like the kind of thing he was supposed to say. That's what we thought, until we ran a trace on the access points. She paused. The intrusion came from a terminal in the janitorial supply closet on sublevel 3. Jimmy blinked. Huh? I was going for surprised, Jimmy said. How'd I do? terribly. Dr. Blackwood crossed her arms. Mr. O'Brien, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you hack into the Academy's computer system? That depends. On what? On whether you're asking as part of an official investigation, or because you need someone to blame for the fact that your security is so bad that a janitor could crack it with a pocket calculator and a strong Wi-Fi signal. The look Dr. Blackwood gave him could have flash-frozen a supernova. This isn't a joke, Mr. O'Brien. That data contained sensitive information about military research projects, diplomatic communications, and personal records of students from some of the most powerful families in the galaxy. If it falls into the wrong hands, it could start wars, topple governments, and generally make everyone's day significantly worse, Jimmy finished. Yeah, I figured. Then you admit you did it? Jimmy scratched the back of his neck, right where his collar usually covered the small tattoo he'd gotten during his military service. The movement was casual, automatic, the kind of thing he'd done 1,000 times without thinking about it. But this time, Dr. Blackwood noticed. Her eyes went wide, and all the color drained from her face like someone had just told her that her retirement fund had been invested in Confederate currency. Oh, she said quietly. Oh shit. Language, Doc, Jimmy said mildly. We're in an academic institution. But Dr. Blackwood wasn't listening. She was staring at his neck, at the small black tattoo that had been revealed when he'd moved his collar. It wasn't much to look at, just 3 small symbols that most people would mistake for some kind of geometric design. Most people, but not Dr. Blackwood. Because Dr. Blackwood, despite her current job as an academic administrator, had spent 5 years as a military intelligence officer before deciding that dealing with alien teenagers was somehow less stressful than dealing with interstellar warfare. And military intelligence officers knew exactly what those 3 symbols meant. Your ghost protocol, she whispered. Jimmy sighed and adjusted his collar back into place. Was, past tense. These days I'm just a guy with a mop and an attitude problem. Ghost protocol, she repeated, like she was trying to convince herself she hadn't imagined it. The most classified special operations unit in human military history. The unit that officially doesn't exist. The unit that saved your collective asses more times than you'll ever know, yeah. Jimmy picked up his mop bucket and started walking down the hallway. But like I said, past tense. These days I specialize in removing stains and listening to pompous aliens explain why their species invented warp drive first. Dr. Blackwood hurried to catch up with him, her heels clicking frantically against the floor. You can't just walk away from this conversation. Watch me. Jimmy didn't slow down. Look, Doc, I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, we've got a former super soldier working as a janitor. This explains everything. But here's the thing. It doesn't explain anything. I mopped floors before I joined Ghost Protocol, and I'm mopping floors now. The only difference is that now I know 17 different ways to kill someone with cleaning supplies. 18, Dr. Blackwood said automatically, then looked mortified that she'd spoken. Jimmy stopped walking and looked at her with new interest. Military intelligence? Former, she said quickly. Very former. Huh. That explains the paranoia and the stress wrinkles. Jimmy resumed walking. So what's your story, Doc? Desk jockey who never saw combat or field agent who saw too much. That's classified. Everything interesting is classified. That's what makes it interesting. They walked in silence for a moment, past lecture halls where alien professors explained the finer points of quantum mechanics to students who were probably more interested in what they were having for lunch. Jimmy had always found something oddly comforting about the academic environment. All that learning happening around him. All those minds working to understand the universe, while he made sure their environment was clean enough for them to think clearly. It was honest work. More honest than some of the things he'd done in the name of protecting humanity's interests in the galaxy. So, Dr. Blackwood said finally, are you going to tell me whether you hacked our system or not? Nope. Why not? Because you already know the answer. Jimmy stopped at the supply closet and started pulling out fresh cleaning supplies. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Dr. Blackwood leaned against the wall and watched him work. I could report you to security. You could. I could have you arrested. You could try. I could have your background investigated. Good luck with that. My file's been classified at levels that don't officially exist. Jimmy loaded his cart with paper towels and disinfectant. Plus, investigating a former Ghost Protocol operative without proper authorization is a federal offense punishable by up to 20 years in a military prison. But hey, you probably knew that already. The silence stretched between them like a taut cable. Jimmy could practically hear Dr. Blackwood's brain working, weighing options, calculating risks, trying to figure out how to handle a situation that definitely wasn't covered in the administrator's handbook. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why what? Why are you here? Why are you working as a janitor when you could be, I don't know, running covert operations, or advising military commanders, or doing whatever it is former Ghost Protocol operatives do?" Jimmy considered the question while he arranged cleaning supplies on his cart. It was a fair question, and one he'd asked himself more than once over the past 3 years. "You ever hear the joke about the retired superhero?" he said finally. "No." "Neither have I, because there aren't any jokes about retired superheroes. You know why?" Jimmy looked up at her. "Because superheroes don't retire. They die in glorious battle, or they disappear mysteriously, or they go insane from the weight of all their responsibilities. But they don't just stop." "But you did." "Yeah, I did." Jimmy started pushing the cart down the hallway again. "You want to know why? Because I got tired of being a weapon. I got tired of being the guy they sent in when diplomacy failed, and everyone needed someone to blame when things went sideways. I got tired of pretending that the ends always justify the means. So you became a janitor. I became a person. There's a difference." Dr. Blackwood walked beside him in silence, occasionally nodding to students who passed by. Jimmy noticed that she kept glancing at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. "The data that was stolen," she said eventually. "It included research on new weapons technology, stuff that could give anyone who has it a significant military advantage. Sounds dangerous." "It is, especially if it ends up in the wrong hands." Jimmy stopped walking and looked at her directly. "Doc, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer." "Okay. Do you trust your government?" Dr. Blackwood blinked. "What kind of question is that?" "The kind that matters. Do you trust the people who are ultimately responsible for all that classified research? Do you trust them to use new weapons technology responsibly? Do you trust them to make decisions that are in the best interests of not just humanity, but all the species we share this galaxy with?" Dr. Blackwood hesitated. "It's not that simple." "Sure it is. Either you trust them, or you don't. Either you believe that the people in charge are making good decisions, or you think someone needs to keep an eye on them. Are you saying you stole that data to, what, protect the galaxy from human military research?" Jimmy resumed walking. "I'm not saying anything. I'm just a janitor who happens to know way too much about computer security and has strong opinions about institutional accountability." "That's not an answer." "Sure it is. It's just not the answer you wanted." They'd reached the main academic building now, the one with the big lecture halls and the fancy holographic displays. Jimmy had always liked this building. It felt more like a real school and less like a corporate training facility. Students from dozens of species mingled in the hallways, discussing everything from advanced mathematics to interspecies dating protocols. "Mr. O'Brien," Dr. Blackwood said as Jimmy started setting up his cleaning station, "I need to know what happened to that data." "Why?" "Because if it's been sold to hostile governments or terrorist organizations, we need to know so we can take countermeasures. And if it hasn't, well, we need to know that too." Jimmy considered this while he filled his mop bucket with hot water and industrial-strength floor cleaner. The stuff smelled like antiseptic and false promises, but it got the job done. "Hypothetically," he said finally, "if someone had accessed that data, and if they were the kind of person who'd spent their career protecting humanity's interests, what do you think they would have done with it?" "I don't know. That's why I'm asking." "Hypothetically," Jimmy continued, "they might have looked at all that weapons research and all those diplomatic communications and all those student records, and they might have realized that some of that information could be very dangerous in the wrong hands. So they'd destroy it? Maybe. Or maybe they'd make sure it ended up in the right hands." Dr. Blackwood frowned. "What do you mean?" Jimmy started mopping the floor with the kind of methodical precision that came from 3 years of practice. "Doc, you've been in military intelligence. You know how these things work. Information is power, and power needs to be balanced. Maybe whoever accessed that data realized that the Academy's security was so bad that it was only a matter of time before someone with genuinely malicious intent got their hands on it. So they took it first. Hypothetically. And then what? Sold it to the highest bidder?" Jimmy stopped mopping and looked at her like she'd just suggested that gravity was optional. "Doc, I'm disappointed. You really think someone who spent their career protecting humanity would just turn around and sell military secrets for profit? Then what? Maybe they made sure the security vulnerabilities were fixed. Maybe they made sure certain research projects that were ethically questionable got the right kind of oversight. Maybe they made sure that information about student safety issues reached the people who could actually do something about it. Jimmy resumed mopping. Hypothetically. Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Jimmy could practically see the gears turning in her head as she worked through the implications. The security upgrades, she said suddenly. The anonymous report about Professor Veltar's conduct. The tip that led to the investigation of the dean's financial irregularities. That was all you. Hypothetically. You didn't steal the data for personal gain. You stole it to protect people. I didn't steal anything, Jimmy said firmly. I'm just a janitor who happened to notice that the Academy's security system had some problems. By hacking into it. By observing that a system with that many vulnerabilities was basically an open invitation for anyone with basic computer skills and questionable morals. Dr. Blackwood leaned against the wall again, watching him work. You know this doesn't change anything, right? Even if your motives were good, what you did was still illegal. Lots of things are illegal, Doc. Doesn't mean they're wrong. That's a dangerous philosophy. Yeah, well, I've lived a dangerous life. Jimmy paused in his mopping to look at her. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know. Sure you do. You've got 3 options. Option 1. You report me to security, I get arrested, and in about 6 months when my case goes to trial, a whole lot of classified information about Academy security failures becomes public record. Option 2. You pretend this conversation never happened, and we both go back to our respective jobs pretending that the Academy's problems have been magically solved by fairies and good intentions. What's option 3? Jimmy grinned. Option 3 is the interesting one. Option 3 is where you realize that maybe having a former Ghost Protocol operative working security for the Academy isn't the worst thing that could happen. You want a job in security? God, no. I hate wearing suits, and I look terrible in a badge. Jimmy resumed mopping. But I wouldn't mind having someone to talk to who understands that sometimes the rules need to be bent a little to keep people safe. Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a moment, thinking this over. Jimmy had learned to recognize the look of someone weighing practical concerns against official procedures. It was the same look military commanders got when they had to decide whether to follow orders or follow their conscience. If I were to hypothetically agree to option 3, she said finally, what would that look like? Hypothetically? It would look like the Academy having an unofficial consultant who helps identify security problems before they become security disasters. Someone who keeps an eye on things from the ground level, where the real information lives. Someone who cleans floors and eavesdrops on conversations. Someone who maintains the physical infrastructure while gathering intelligence on potential threats to student and faculty safety, Jimmy corrected. It's all about how you frame it. And in exchange? In exchange, the Academy gets better security, fewer scandals, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing that someone with actual experience in dealing with bad guys is keeping an eye on things. Dr. Blackwood looked around the hallway, taking in the students and faculty going about their daily routines, oblivious to the conversation happening right next to them. This is insane, she said. Most of the best ideas are. I could lose my job. You could lose your job for a lot of reasons. At least this way, you'd lose it for trying to keep people safe. And if I say no? Jimmy shrugged. Then you say no. I keep mopping floors, you keep administrating, and we both pretend that the Academy's security problems will solve themselves through the power of positive thinking. But they won't. Nope. If anything, they'll get worse. The galaxy's a dangerous place, Doc, and it's getting more dangerous every day. The Academy's got students from some of the most politically sensitive families in known space, faculty working on research that could change the balance of power between entire civilizations, and security systems that were apparently designed by someone who thought password was too complicated. You're saying we need you. I'm saying you need someone. Whether that's me or someone else, that's up to you. Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a long time, watching Jimmy work. He'd moved on to cleaning the holographic displays now, carefully removing dust and fingerprints from the delicate equipment. It was detail work that required patience and precision, qualities that served him well in both his current job and his former career. There would have to be conditions, she said finally. I figured. Official oversight, regular reports, and absolutely no more unauthorized access to Academy systems. Define unauthorized. Mr. O'Brien. Fine, fine. No more hacking. Scout's honor. You were never a scout. How do you know? Because scouts don't grow up to become Ghost Protocol operatives. Jimmy grinned. You'd be surprised. Some of us were very well-rounded children. Despite herself, Dr. Blackwood smiled. This is still insane. Yeah, but it's the good kind of insane. The kind that might actually work. And if it doesn't, then we're no worse off than we were before. Except I'll have someone to have intelligent conversations with during my lunch breaks. Dr. Blackwood extended her hand. All right, Mr. O'Brien, let's see how this works out. Jimmy shook her hand, noting that she had a firm grip and calluses that suggested she'd spent time doing more than pushing papers. Looking forward to it, Doc. One more thing, she said as she turned to leave. Yeah? That student you were talking to earlier? Zrextal the Magnificent? The purple pain in the ass? What about him? His family has been getting death threats. Someone's been sending anonymous messages claiming that their trading empire is built on slave labor and that they're going to pay for their crimes. Jimmy considered this. Huh. The threats started 3 days ago. Same day as the security breach. Same day as the security breach. Dr. Blackwood looked at him meaningfully. I don't suppose you'd know anything about that. Jimmy resumed cleaning the holographic display, his movements careful and precise. Doc, I'm just a janitor. But if I were the kind of person who had access to classified information about various alien families and their business practices, and if I were the kind of person who believed in justice and accountability, I might have some opinions about trading empires built on exploitation. That's not an answer. Sure it is. It's just not the answer you expected. Jimmy looked up from his work. But hypothetically, if someone were sending threatening messages to families with questionable business practices, they'd be better off focusing on evidence and legal remedies rather than anonymous threats. Much more effective in the long run. Is that advice? That's common sense. Anonymous threats just make people defensive. Public investigations and media attention, on the other hand. Jimmy shrugged. Those tend to produce actual results. Dr. Blackwood studied his face for a moment, as if trying to read his thoughts. I think this partnership is going to be very interesting, Mr. O'Brien. I think you're right, Doc. After she left, Jimmy continued his work, methodically cleaning displays and polishing surfaces while his mind processed the implications of their conversation. It had been 3 years since he'd had a real job. The kind that mattered. The kind that made a difference. He'd almost forgotten what it felt like to use his skills for something more meaningful than maintaining floor shine. Excuse me, human. Jimmy looked up to see another student. This one a tall, thin Andromedian with the kind of ethereal beauty that made humans feel simultaneously attracted and inadequate. Her name was Kestra, and she was one of the few students who'd ever bothered to be polite to him. What can I do for you, Miss Kestra? I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that all Andromedians seemed to possess. For what you did. Jimmy paused in his cleaning. I'm not sure what you mean. The report about the safety violations in the dormitory air recycling systems. The one that led to the emergency repairs last week. She smiled, and Jimmy was reminded why humans had such a complicated relationship with Andromedan beauty standards. I know it was you. How could you possibly know that? Because you're the only maintenance worker who would have understood the technical specifications well enough to identify the problem, and the only person with access to the systems who would have cared enough to report it anonymously. Jimmy resumed cleaning, trying to look casual. That's a lot of assumptions. My people have a saying, Kestra continued. The guardian who hides in plain sight is the most effective protector of all. I think perhaps humans have guardians too. Before Jimmy could respond, she was gone, gliding down the hallway with the graceful movement that made Andromedians look like they were perpetually dancing. Jimmy stood there for a moment, processing what she'd said. Guardian. He'd never thought of himself that way, but maybe that's what he'd become. Not a weapon, not a soldier, not even a janitor. Just someone who kept watch, who noticed problems, who made sure the people around him were safe. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it was the career he'd chosen. And for the first time in 3 years, it felt like enough. Mr. O'Brien? Jimmy turned to see Dr. Blackwood approaching again, this time carrying a tablet and looking official. Back so soon, Doc? Miss me already? I've been thinking about our conversation, she said. And I realize there's something I need to ask you. Shoot. The weapons research data that was stolen. Some of it was concerning. Research into biological agents, autonomous weapon systems, things that could cause massive casualties if they were weaponized. Jimmy stopped cleaning and gave her his full attention. Go on. I need to know, and I mean really know, that information is secure, because if it's not, if there's even a chance it could fall into the wrong hands. Doc, Jimmy interrupted gently. Let me ask you something. In all your time in military intelligence, did you ever encounter a situation where you had to choose between following orders and doing what you knew was right? Yes. What did you choose? Dr. Blackwood was quiet for a moment. I chose to do what was right. It cost me my career. But not your conscience. No, not my conscience. Jimmy nodded. The information you're worried about, the really dangerous stuff, it's been destroyed. Wiped from every system, every backup, every shadow file. It doesn't exist anymore. How can you be sure? Because I made sure. Because some knowledge is too dangerous to exist, regardless of who might want to use it. Jimmy resumed cleaning, his movements steady and methodical. The other stuff, the research that could actually help people, the diplomatic communications that expose corruption, the student safety reports, that information found its way to people who could use it responsibly. You made that decision yourself? Someone had to. Dr. Blackwood looked at him for a long moment, and Jimmy could see her mentally filing this information away. That's a lot of responsibility for one person. Yeah, well, I've had practice. Ghost Protocol operatives don't usually work alone. Former Ghost Protocol operatives do whatever works. Jimmy paused in his cleaning to look at her directly. Doc, I know this is hard to believe, but I'm not trying to be mysterious or dramatic. I'm just trying to do the right thing with the skills I have and the opportunities I'm given. Even if it means breaking the law? Especially if it means breaking the law. Laws are written by people, and people make mistakes. Sometimes you have to break a law to uphold justice. Dr. Blackwood nodded slowly. I think I'm beginning to understand why Ghost Protocol recruited you. Actually, it was the other way around. I recruited them. What do you mean? Jimmy grinned. Long story. Buy me a coffee sometime and I'll tell you about it. As if summoned by the mention of coffee, Zrekstal the Magnificent appeared at the end of the hallway, moving toward them with the kind of determined stride that suggested he'd been building up courage for this conversation. Oh, wonderful, Jimmy muttered. Round 2. Human, Zrekstal called out as he approached. I've been thinking about our conversation. That's concerning, Jimmy replied. Should I be worried about smoke damage? Dr. Blackwood hid a smile behind her tablet. Zrekstal's scales were currently a muted purple, which Jimmy had learned meant he was trying to appear serious and thoughtful. I owe you an apology. Jimmy blinked. Come again? An apology, Zrekstal repeated, his head frills drooping slightly. I have been investigating some of the things you said earlier. Oh boy, Jimmy said under his breath. This should be good. You were correct about my academic performance, and about the security vulnerabilities, and about... Zrekstal's scales shifted to a darker shade of purple. About several other matters that I will not discuss in public. Dr. Blackwood and Jimmy exchanged glances. Jimmy could practically see her making mental notes about which secrets might be walking around campus attached to spoiled alien teenagers. So you're apologizing because I was right? Jimmy asked. That's refreshingly honest, but probably not great for your social standing. I am apologizing because I treated you as if your opinions were worthless simply because of your occupation. Zrekstal straightened to his full height, which was considerable. This was inappropriate. Inappropriate is one word for it, Jimmy agreed. Stupid, arrogant, and classist would be others. Yes, Zrekstal said simply. Those two. Jimmy stopped cleaning and really looked at the Vorthak for the first time. Stripped of his earlier bluster and indignation, Zrekstal looked like what he actually was. A kid barely out of his teens, trying to figure out how to navigate a complicated galaxy with nothing but his family's money and his own untested intelligence. You know what, kid? Jimmy said finally. Apology accepted. Takes guts to admit when you're wrong. Thank you. Zrekstal hesitated. May I ask you something? Shoot. How did you know about my grades? About the security problems? About... He gestured vaguely. Everything? Jimmy glanced at Dr. Blackwood, who gave him a subtle nod. Because I pay attention. Because people talk around me like I'm invisible, and I listen. Because I've got more education than most people assume, and I know how to put pieces together. You have education? Zrekstal's scales flickered with interest. In what fields? Physics, engineering, a few other things. Jimmy resumed cleaning, trying to look casual. Just because someone's mopping floors doesn't mean that's all they're capable of. But why are you here? Why work as a custodian when you could be teaching, or researching, or— Kid, let me give you some free advice, Jimmy interrupted. The most important thing you can learn in life is that everyone has a story, and most of those stories are more complicated than they appear on the surface. Judge people by their actions, not their job titles. Zrextal nodded slowly. Is that why you helped with the safety violations? And the other problems? I helped because people were at risk, and I was in a position to do something about it. Simple as that. Not so simple, Dr. Blackwood interjected. Not everyone would have taken those risks. Yeah, well, not everyone's as stupid as me. Jimmy finished cleaning the display he'd been working on and moved to the next one. But that's the thing about being stupid. Sometimes it means you do the right thing instead of the smart thing. I do not think you are stupid, Zrextal said seriously. I think perhaps you are the smartest person at this academy. Nah, Jimmy replied. I'm just the one with the least to lose. This was a lie, of course. Jimmy had plenty to lose: his anonymity, his peaceful existence, his carefully constructed life of honest work and simple problems. But he'd learned a long time ago that sometimes the most effective way to help people was to let them think you didn't care about the consequences. Mr. O'Brien, Dr. Blackwood said, could I see you in my office later today, say 4 o'clock? Am I in trouble? No more than usual. Then sure, but I get off at 3:30, so you're buying the coffee. After Dr. Blackwood left, Jimmy found himself alone with Zrextal, who seemed reluctant to leave. The young Vorthak was fidgeting with his tablet, opening and closing applications without any apparent purpose. Something on your mind, kid? The threats, Zrextal said quietly. The ones my family has been receiving. Jimmy's hands stilled on his cleaning cloth. What about them? They are not wrong. Zrextal's scales had shifted to a pale, almost translucent purple. About my family's business practices. About the labor conditions on our Outer Rim facilities. That's a heavy thing to carry around. I've been trying to convince my father to reform our operations for months, but he says it would be too expensive, that our competitors would gain an advantage. Zrextal looked up at Jimmy. The threats are frightening, but they are also not entirely unjustified. Jimmy considered this carefully. The kid was clearly struggling with something bigger than academic performance and family expectations. You know, Jimmy said finally, sometimes change comes from the inside. Sometimes the next generation has to be the one to fix the mistakes of the previous one. But I am only one person, and I'm still just a student. Kid, you're the heir to a trading empire. That's not just anything. Jimmy resumed cleaning, keeping his voice casual. And sometimes one person with the right information and the right motivation can make a bigger difference than an entire army. What do you mean? I mean that if someone were to, hypothetically, gather evidence of labor violations and present it to the right authorities, or to the galactic media, or to consumer advocacy groups, well, that might be more effective than anonymous threats. Zrextal was quiet for a moment, processing this. You think I should expose my own family? I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. Jimmy paused in his work. But here's the thing. If you don't do something, someone else will. And they might not be as interested in giving your family a chance to reform voluntarily. Is that a threat? Jimmy looked at him directly. Kid, if I wanted to threaten you, you'd know it. That's just the way the galaxy works. Information wants to be free, and secrets have a way of coming to light whether the people keeping them want them to or not. Zrextal nodded slowly. You are suggesting I get ahead of the problem. I'm suggesting you think about what kind of person you want to be, and what kind of legacy you want to inherit. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Jimmy cleaning and Zrextal apparently deep in thought. It wasn't until Jimmy started packing up his supplies that the young Vorthak spoke again. Mr. O'Brien, if someone were to hypothetically want to gather evidence of labor violations within their own family's company, how might they go about it? Jimmy grinned. Hypothetically? They might start by reviewing employment contracts, safety reports, and worker complaint logs. They might also want to look at medical records for company facilities, and maybe cross-reference injury rates with industry standards. And if they found evidence of violations? Hypothetically, they might want to consult with a labor rights attorney, or maybe reach out to one of the galactic worker advocacy organizations. I hear the Centauri Labor Alliance is pretty effective at getting results. Hypothetically. Jimmy finished packing his cart. Of course, someone doing that kind of investigation would want to be very careful about document security and communication protocols. Wouldn't want sensitive information falling into the wrong hands. Of course not. And they'd probably want to have a solid legal and financial plan for implementing reforms before they went public with any evidence. Change is easier when you can offer solutions along with criticism. Zrextal's scales had brightened considerably. That makes sense? It's just common sense, really. Jimmy started pushing his cart toward the supply closet. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a janitor. Mr. O'Brien? Yeah, kid. Thank you. For what? For treating me like I could be better than I am. Jimmy stopped walking and looked back at the young Vorthak. Kid, you don't need to be better than you are. You just need to be who you are, but on purpose. After Zrextal left, Jimmy made his way to the supply closet to finish organizing his equipment. It had been an interesting day, even by his standards. New partnerships, old secrets coming to light, and the possibility that he might actually be able to use his skills for something meaningful again. He was just finishing up when his communicator buzzed with an incoming message. The sender ID was blocked, but Jimmy recognized the encryption pattern. Military intelligence, high priority. He opened the message and read, James O'Brien, Ghost Protocol reactivation requested. Priority Alpha. Report to coordinates attached within 72 hours. Authentication code 77 Baker 9. Jimmy stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. 5 minutes later, another message arrived. Mr. O'Brien, your services are required for matter of galactic security. Compensation package attached. This is not a request. Jimmy deleted that one too. The third message was different. Jimmy, they've got Sarah and the kids. Help us. And Jimmy's blood went cold. Sarah was his sister, the one person he'd stayed in touch with after leaving Ghost Protocol. Her kids were his nephew and niece, 8 and 10 years old respectively. And M was Major Patricia Martinez, his former commanding officer and one of the few people in the galaxy who knew how to find him. He started typing a response, then stopped. This felt wrong. Too convenient, too perfectly designed to get him to respond. Sarah lived on Earth, in one of the most secure residential zones in human space. Her ex-husband was a federal marshal. The kids went to a school with military-grade security. Jimmy pulled up his personal communication protocols and sent a coded message to Sarah's emergency contact system. The response came back immediately. All family members safe and accounted for. No security concerns. So the third message was fake, which meant someone was trying very hard to get his attention. Jimmy sat down at his workstation, a modified terminal he'd built into his supply closet that looked like standard maintenance equipment, but was actually connected to several highly illegal intelligence networks, and started digging. The fake messages had been sent using stolen Ghost Protocol communication codes, but the encryption was slightly off. Someone with access to classified military systems but not the current operational protocols. The timing was interesting too. Right after his conversation with Dr. Blackwood about the stolen Academy data. Jimmy pulled up the Academy's communication logs and cross-referenced them with the message timestamps. Sure enough, someone had been monitoring internal Academy communications, looking for keywords related to security breaches and classified information. Well, Jimmy said to himself, that's not good. He started tracing the monitoring signals, following digital breadcrumbs through a maze of relay stations and proxy servers. The trail led through several criminal networks and black market information brokers before terminating at a location that made Jimmy's stomach drop. The signals were coming from a ship currently docked at Kepler Station, specifically from a vessel registered to the Vorthak trading empire. Jimmy leaned back in his chair and considered the implications. Either this was an incredible coincidence, or Zrextal's family problems were about to become everyone's problems. He was still processing this when his workstation chimed with an incoming priority alert. Someone was attempting to access the Academy's main computer system, using administrator-level credentials. Jimmy pulled up the intrusion detection system and watched as someone systematically worked their way through the Academy's security protocols. They were good, better than the average hacker, but not as good as they thought they were. They'd made it through the first 3 security layers, but they were about to run into the additional protections Jimmy had quietly installed over the past few months. Come on, Jimmy muttered, watching the intrusion attempt. Show me what you're really after. The hacker had reached the student records database and was searching for something specific. Jimmy watched as they pulled up files for several high-profile students, children of diplomats, military commanders, and corporate executives. They were downloading everything: academic records, personal information, family contacts, security protocols. This wasn't random. This was targeted intelligence gathering. Jimmy initiated a trace on the intrusion, following the signal back to its source. As he'd suspected, it was coming from the same ship that had been monitoring Academy communications. But now he had a problem. The hacker was good enough to notice the trace, and they were starting to implement countermeasures. Jimmy had maybe 30 seconds before they either escaped or triggered some kind of destructive protocol that would wipe their trail. Time for a more direct approach. Jimmy cracked his knuckles and dove into the Academy's network with the kind of digital aggression that had made him legendary in certain circles. Instead of trying to trace the hacker, he went on the offensive, launching a counter-intrusion that bypassed their defenses and gave him direct access to their systems. What he found there made him very angry. The ship wasn't just gathering intelligence on Academy students. They had detailed files on dozens of young people from politically sensitive families across the galaxy, complete with kidnapping protocols, ransom demands, and contingency plans for various scenarios. They were slave traders. High-end, sophisticated slave traders who specialized in kidnapping the children of powerful families and selling them to the highest bidder. And they'd been using the Academy as a shopping catalog. Jimmy copied everything, every file, every communication, every operational plan, and stored it in his secure partition. Then he started uploading it to every law enforcement database, media outlet, and intelligence agency he could access. But he wasn't done yet. He traced the ship's communication logs and found something interesting. They'd been in contact with someone at the Academy. Someone who'd been feeding them information about student schedules, security protocols, and family backgrounds. Jimmy pulled up the communication metadata and cross-referenced it with Academy personnel records. The messages were coming from an encrypted terminal in the administrative wing, registered to Dr. Lyra Blackwood. Son of a bitch, Jimmy whispered. His first instinct was betrayal and anger. He'd trusted her, opened up to her, agreed to work with her. And all along, she'd been selling out students to kidnappers and slave traders. But then his training kicked in, and he started thinking like an investigator instead of a betrayed friend. The communications had started 3 months ago, well before their conversation today. The encryption protocols were standard Academy issue, not the military-grade stuff someone with Dr. Blackwood's background would have used. And the timing of the messages didn't match her known schedule. Several had been sent when she was off station for conferences. Someone was using her credentials, but it probably wasn't her. Jimmy dug deeper, looking at access logs and security footage. The messages had been sent from Dr. Blackwood's terminal, but according to the biometric scanners, she hadn't been in her office when they were transmitted. Someone with administrative access had been using her identity to communicate with the slavers. Jimmy pulled up the personnel records for everyone with the necessary clearance to access Dr. Blackwood's terminal remotely. The list was short. Only 5 people had the combination of administrative privileges and technical skills necessary to pull off this kind of deception. One name jumped out at him, Dr. Marcus Reed, Associate Dean of Student Services. A human who'd been at the Academy for 8 years, with a background in computer systems and a financial situation that suggested he might be motivated by money. Jimmy was cross-referencing Dr. Reed's schedule with the communication timestamps when his workstation chimed with an emergency alert. Someone was in the building. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Jimmy pulled up the security camera feeds and felt his blood turn to ice. 3 figures in dark clothing were moving through the Academy's lower levels, heading toward the dormitories. They moved with the kind of professional efficiency that screamed military training, and they were carrying equipment that was definitely not standard Academy issue. The slave traders weren't waiting for more intelligence. They were making their move tonight. Jimmy grabbed his emergency kit, a small bag of equipment that he'd hoped he'd never need to use again, and headed for the door. Then he stopped and did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He activated his Ghost Protocol emergency beacon. The signal would take about 10 minutes to reach the nearest military installation, and another 20 minutes for a response team to arrive. That meant Jimmy had to keep the kidnappers busy for half an hour without getting himself killed. No pressure. Jimmy made his way through the Academy's service corridors, using maintenance passages that weren't shown on any public floor plans. He'd spent 3 years learning every inch of this building, and now that knowledge might be the difference between life and death for a bunch of spoiled alien kids who'd never even acknowledged his existence. The irony wasn't lost on him. He reached the dormitory level just as the intruders were breaking into the first residential wing. Jimmy watched from a concealed position as they moved with practiced efficiency, using some kind of sleeping gas to incapacitate students before they could raise an alarm. These weren't random criminals. These were professionals with military-grade equipment and detailed intelligence about Academy security protocols. Jimmy counted 6 targets so far, all from families that appeared on the slave traders' priority list. The kidnappers were being selective, taking only high-value targets and leaving the rest undisturbed. Jimmy activated his comm unit and sent an emergency alert to Academy security, then settled in to wait for backup. Except backup wasn't coming. According to his scanner, the Academy's security system had been compromised. All alerts were being intercepted and redirected to a dummy server. The automated defense systems had been disabled. Even the emergency communication channels had been blocked. Jimmy was on his own. "Well," he said quietly to himself, "looks like retirement's over." Jimmy opened his emergency kit and began assembling equipment he'd hoped never to use again. A modified stunner with enough power to drop a Rigelian cave bear. Smoke grenades designed to work in enclosed spaces. A tactical knife that could cut through most standard body armor. And his old Ghost Protocol combat suit, compressed into a package no larger than a deck of cards. Jimmy had sworn he'd never wear the suit again. It represented everything he'd tried to leave behind. The violence, the moral compromises, the weight of decisions that could affect the fate of entire star systems. But right now, 6 kids were being kidnapped by professional slavers, and he was the only person in position to do anything about it. Jimmy put on the suit. The transformation was immediate and unsettling. The suit's bio-neural interface connected directly to his nervous system, enhancing his reflexes, strength, and sensory input while providing real-time tactical analysis. It had been 3 years since he'd worn it, but his body remembered the sensation like an old song. Jimmy felt himself slipping back into patterns of thought and movement that he'd worked hard to forget. The part of his mind that calculated kill zones and threat assessments. The part that could make life and death decisions without hesitation or remorse. The part that made him very, very dangerous. Jimmy moved through the academy like a ghost, using every trick he'd learned in a decade of covert operations. The kidnappers were good, but they were operating in his territory now, and they didn't know he was coming. He took the first one out silently, using a chokehold that left the man unconscious but alive. Jimmy had made a promise to himself years ago that he wouldn't kill unless absolutely necessary, and he intended to keep that promise. The second kidnapper was monitoring communications from a central position. Jimmy disabled him with the stunner, then used the man's equipment to listen in on the operation. Alpha Team, report status. 6 targets acquired, moving to extraction point. Copy that. Beta Team, what's your status on the security override? All systems still down. No response from Academy security. Excellent. Omega Team, prepare for pickup. We'll be at the extraction point in 10 minutes. Jimmy smiled grimly. They thought they had 10 minutes. They were wrong. He made his way to the extraction point, a service tunnel that connected to the Academy's loading dock. The kidnappers had chosen well. It was isolated, with multiple escape routes and minimal security coverage. Jimmy positioned himself in the shadows and waited. The first group of kidnappers arrived carrying unconscious students, including Zrextal and Kestra. Jimmy felt a surge of anger at seeing the young Andromedian's limp form. She'd trusted him to keep her safe, and he'd failed. Time to fix that. Jimmy activated a smoke grenade and threw it into the middle of the group. As confusion spread, he moved. The Ghost Protocol combat suit enhanced his speed and strength, but more importantly, it enhanced his tactical awareness. Jimmy could see threat vectors, probability matrices, and optimal response patterns overlaid on his vision like a heads-up display. He moved through the group of kidnappers like a force of nature, using non-lethal techniques to disable them one by one. Pressure points, nerve strikes, joint locks, all delivered with the kind of precision that came from years of training and experience. Within 90 seconds, 5 professional kidnappers were unconscious on the floor, and Jimmy was checking on the students. They were alive but heavily sedated. Jimmy activated his medical scanner and confirmed that the sleeping gas was non-toxic and would wear off within an hour. The kids would be fine, though they'd probably have headaches and weird dreams. Jimmy was calling for medical assistance when he heard slow applause from behind him. "Very impressive, Mr. O'Brien. Or should I say, Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien, Ghost Protocol retired." Jimmy turned to see Dr. Marcus Reed standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 more armed men. The Associate Dean looked nothing like the mild-mannered academic administrator Jimmy had occasionally seen in the hallways. His posture was different, his eyes were alert, and he was holding a military-grade plasma rifle like he knew how to use it. "Dr. Reed," Jimmy said calmly, "I have to say, I didn't see this coming." "Few people do. That's what makes me good at what I do." Reed stepped closer, keeping the rifle trained on Jimmy. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about how you identified me so quickly." "Lucky guess." "I don't think so. Ghost Protocol operatives don't believe in luck." Reed gestured to his companions. "Secure the targets. We're leaving." "I don't think so," Jimmy replied. Reed laughed. "Mr. O'Brien, you're outnumbered 3 to 1, and my men are carrying weapons that could vaporize you before you could blink. What exactly do you think you're going to do?" Jimmy smiled. Something I probably should have done 3 years ago. He activated the combat suit's emergency protocol. The suit had been designed for situations where a Ghost Protocol operative was outnumbered and outgunned. In emergency mode, it would enhance the wearer's capabilities to superhuman levels for exactly 60 seconds, after which it would shut down to prevent permanent neurological damage. 60 seconds was more than enough. Jimmy moved faster than human reflexes could track, disarming the first gunman before the man could even register that he was under attack. The second gunman managed to fire one shot, which missed by inches, before Jimmy put him down with a nerve strike that would keep him unconscious for hours. That left Dr. Reed, who had the presence of mind to drop his rifle and raise his hands. "Very impressive," Reed said. "But you're still too late." "What do you mean?" Reed smiled. "The students you just rescued? They weren't the primary targets, they were bait." Jimmy felt his stomach drop. "Explain." "While you were playing hero down here, my associates were extracting the real prize. 3 students from families so politically sensitive that their disappearance will destabilize entire sectors of the galaxy." "Who?" "Princess Velana of the Centauri Royal House, Ambassador Kextor's son from the Regelian Federation, and the daughter of the Terran colonial governor." Reed's smile turned nasty. "By now, they're already off station and beyond your reach." Jimmy activated his comm unit and tried to contact Academy security. Nothing. He tried the emergency channels. Still nothing. "The communication blackout is still in effect," Reed said helpfully, "and it will remain so until my ship is safely away." Jimmy was calculating response options when his suit's tactical display highlighted something interesting. According to the bioscanners, there were still life signs in the dormitory wings, including 3 signatures that matched the physiological profiles of the students Reed had just mentioned. "You're lying," Jimmy said. "Am I?" "The students are still here. Your operation failed." Reed's confident expression faltered slightly. "That's impossible. My team confirmed extraction of all primary targets." "Your team confirmed extraction of 3 unconscious bodies that they assumed were the right targets." Jimmy grinned. "Rookie mistake. Always verify identity before extraction." The truth was, Jimmy wasn't entirely sure what had happened, but Reed's reaction told him that something had gone wrong with the kidnapping operation, and that was good enough for now. Jimmy was about to press his advantage when his comm unit suddenly crackled to life. "Ghost Protocol actual to Mr. O'Brien. Please respond." Jimmy hesitated, then activated the channel. "This is O'Brien. Lieutenant Colonel, this is Colonel Harrison, Ghost Protocol Command. We received your emergency beacon and have a response team en route. What's your status?" 6 kidnappers neutralized, students secure, but the operation may have additional components I haven't identified yet." "Copy that. ETA on response team is 12 minutes. Can you hold position?" Jimmy looked at Dr. Reed, who was now looking significantly less confident. "Yeah, I can hold position." "Outstanding. Be advised, we've also received intelligence that this operation is connected to a larger slave trading network. We're going to need a full debrief when this is over." "Understood." Jimmy closed the channel and looked at Reed. "So, Doc, want to tell me about this larger network? Or should I wait for the professionals to ask you?" Reed's composure had completely cracked now. "You don't understand what you're interfering with. These people I work for, they're not going to just give up because one operation failed. Then we'll stop the next one too. There are dozens of operations, hundreds of targets. You can't stop them all." "Maybe not," Jimmy agreed. "But I can stop you, and that's a start." Reed slumped against the wall, defeated. "They'll kill me if I talk." "They'll kill you anyway. At least if you cooperate, you might live long enough to see them arrested." Before Reed could respond, Jimmy's tactical display lit up with new contacts. The Ghost Protocol response team had arrived, and they were moving through the academy with the kind of professional efficiency that made Jimmy nostalgic for his old career. "Mr. O'Brien, this is Team Leader Martinez. What's your location?" Jimmy smiled. He'd wondered if it would be her. "Service Tunnel Alpha 7, near the loading dock. I've got 1 suspect in custody and several others who are going to need medical attention." "Copy that. We're en route." 3 minutes later, Major Patricia Martinez appeared in the doorway, wearing full combat gear and carrying enough firepower to level a city block. She looked exactly the same as she had 3 years ago, compact, dangerous, and completely unimpressed by everything around her. "Jimmy," she said, "you look like hell." "Nice to see you too, Pat. How's retirement treating you?" "About as well as it's treating you, apparently." Martinez gestured to the unconscious kidnappers. "Want to tell me what happened here?" Jimmy gave her a quick briefing while her team secured the area and attended to the students. Zrextal was starting to wake up, looking confused and slightly nauseous. Kestra was still unconscious but appeared to be unharmed. "So let me get this straight," Martinez said when he finished. "You uncovered a slave trading operation, identified the inside man, and neutralized 6 armed kidnappers, all while working as a janitor?" "Pretty much, yeah." "And you did this without backup, without proper equipment, and without authorization from any official agency?" "Also yes." Martinez shook her head. "You realize this is exactly the kind of reckless, unauthorized, technically illegal heroics that made you impossible to work with, right?" "Is that a complaint or a compliment?" "Both." Martinez looked around at the rescued students and neutralized threats. "But I have to admit the results speak for themselves." Dr. Blackwood appeared in the doorway, looking harried and concerned. "Mr. O'Brien, are you all right? I heard there was some kind of incident." She stopped when she saw the Ghost Protocol team and the unconscious kidnappers. "Oh, Dr. Blackwood," Jimmy said. "Meet Major Martinez, Ghost Protocol. Pat, this is Dr. Blackwood, the Dean of Student Affairs and my new consultant." "Consultant?" Martinez raised an eyebrow. "It's complicated." "With you it always is." Martinez turned to Dr. Blackwood. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to debrief you about Academy security protocols and any intelligence you might have about this kidnapping operation." "Of course," Dr. Blackwood said. "But first, Mr. O'Brien, how did you know this was going to happen?" Jimmy considered how much to tell her. The truth was complicated and would probably result in more questions than answers. "I noticed some suspicious communication patterns and decided to investigate," he said finally. "Turns out my paranoia was justified." Dr. Blackwood looked at him for a long moment, clearly recognizing that this was not the whole truth. "I see. The important thing is that everyone's safe," Jimmy continued. "Well, except for Dr. Reed over there, who's probably going to spend the next 20 years in a federal prison." 30 to life, actually, Martinez corrected. "Kidnapping, conspiracy, and treason carry some pretty stiff penalties." Reed, who had been listening to this conversation with growing horror, finally spoke up. "I want to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Martinez asked. "Full cooperation, names, locations, operational details, financial records, everything I know about the slave trading network, in exchange for protective custody and a reduced sentence." Martinez looked at Jimmy. "What do you think?" "I think that depends on how much he actually knows, and how useful his information turns out to be." Jimmy walked over to Reed. "But I also think that 30 years in prison is better than being dead. Which is what's going to happen to you if your former associates think you might talk." Reed nodded frantically. "Yes, exactly. They'll kill me if they think I'm a liability." "Then you'd better make sure your information is valuable enough to keep you alive." Martinez's comm unit crackled. "Team leader, this is Ops. We've intercepted a transmission from the suspect vessel. They're requesting permission to depart the station." "Negative," Martinez replied immediately. "Lock down all departures until further notice." "Copy that. Station security is implementing a full lockdown now." Jimmy looked at Martinez. "Think we got them all?" "Won't know until we round up everyone on that ship and compare it to Reed's information." Martinez gestured to her team. "But I'd say the odds are pretty good." Dr. Blackwood had been watching this exchange with growing amazement. "Mr. O'Brien, I think I'm beginning to understand why you were so confident about Academy security." "How's that?" "Because you weren't just observing problems. You were actively preparing to deal with them." Jimmy shrugged. "Old habits. Ghost Protocol habits," Martinez corrected. "Jimmy, I know you're retired, but we could really use someone with your skills and experience. The galaxy's getting more dangerous, and we need people who can handle situations like this." "Thanks, but no thanks," Jimmy said. "I like my new job." "Mopping floors?" "Keeping people safe." Jimmy looked around at the students, who were starting to recover from the sedatives. "It's honest work." Martinez smiled. "You know, Jimmy, I think retirement might actually suit you." "Don't sound so surprised." 2 hours later, after the Ghost Protocol team had finished their sweep and taken Reed and his associates into custody, Jimmy found himself back in the supply closet, changing out of his combat suit and back into his janitor's coveralls. It felt strange, like putting on a costume. For a few hours, he'd been Lieutenant Colonel James O'Brien again, Ghost Protocol operative, savior of the innocent. Now he was just Jimmy the janitor, guy with a mop and an attitude problem. Except he wasn't really. He'd never been just a janitor. and after tonight everyone would know it. Dr. Blackwood knocked on the closet door. Mr. O'Brien? Are you in there? Come in, Doc. She entered the small space and looked around at his equipment, some of which was decidedly non-standard for janitorial work. So this is where the magic happens. If by magic you mean obsessive monitoring of Academy security systems, then yes. Jimmy, she said, and he noticed she'd dropped the formal address. I owe you an apology. For what? For not taking you seriously. For assuming that just because you worked as a janitor you weren't capable of, well, this. She gestured vaguely at the equipment around them. Doc, you couldn't have known. That was kind of the point. But I should have recognized the signs. The way you talked about security, the things you knew, the way you handled yourself. She paused. You were hiding in plain sight. Best place to hide sometimes. Are you going to stay? Jimmy considered the question. That depends. On what? On whether you still think the Academy needs an unofficial security consultant who happens to mop floors in his spare time. Dr. Blackwood smiled. I think that might be exactly what we need. Even though I'm clearly more trouble than I'm worth? Especially because of that. Jimmy grinned. Then I guess I'm staying. Good. Dr. Blackwood turned to leave, then paused. Jimmy, thank you for tonight, for everything. Those kids owe you their lives. They don't owe me anything, Jimmy said. That's what makes it worth doing. After Dr. Blackwood left, Jimmy sat alone in his supply closet, surrounded by mops and cleaning chemicals and highly illegal surveillance equipment. It had been a long day, even by his standards. His comm unit buzzed with a message from Major Martinez. Slave trading ship secured. Found evidence of operations spanning 12 star systems. Reads information checking out. Nice work, Jimmy. Another message followed immediately. Offer still stands if you change your mind about coming back. Galaxy needs people like you. Jimmy smiled and typed back. Thanks, but I'm good where I am. Try not to save the galaxy without me. The response came quickly. Wouldn't dream of it. Stay safe, Colonel. Jimmy deleted the conversation and powered down his equipment. Tomorrow, he'd go back to mopping floors and listening to lectures about quantum mechanics. He'd empty trash cans and clean holographic displays and pretend to be invisible while keeping an eye on things. But tonight had reminded him why that mattered. Everyone deserved to be safe, to learn, to grow, to become whoever they were meant to be. And sometimes, keeping people safe meant being the guy with the mop who happened to know 17 different ways to incapacitate an armed kidnapper. 18, actually, but who was counting? Jimmy was packing up his cleaning supplies when he heard a soft knock on the door. He opened it to find Zrextal standing in the hallway, looking considerably more subdued than usual. Hey, kid, shouldn't you be in the medical bay getting checked out? I was released an hour ago, Zrextal said. The doctors said I would have a headache for a day or two, but otherwise I am unharmed. Good to hear. Jimmy resumed packing his cart. How are you feeling? Confused, grateful, and... Zrextal paused. Ashamed. Ashamed of what? Of how I treated you. Of how we all treated you. The young Vorthak's scales had shifted to a muted gray that Jimmy had learned indicated deep embarrassment. You saved our lives, and for 3 years, we have barely acknowledged your existence. Kid, you don't need to. Yes, I do. Zrextal straightened to his full height. My people have a saying. Honor is not given by birth, but earned through action. Tonight, you showed more honor than anyone I have ever met. Jimmy stopped packing and looked at the young alien. Zrextal, you want to know the truth? I didn't save you because you're important, or because your family has money, or because you're going to grow up to be some kind of galactic leader. Then why? Because you're a kid who was in trouble, and I was in a position to help. That's it. That's the whole reason. Zrextal was quiet for a moment, processing this. That makes it more honorable, not less. If you say so, I do say so. And I want you to know, I have been thinking about what you said earlier. About evidence and legal remedies, and getting ahead of problems. Yeah? I have decided to contact the Centauri Labor Alliance. I am going to help them investigate my family's business practices, and I am going to work with them to implement reforms. Jimmy smiled. That's good, kid. That's really good. It will not be easy. My father will be angry. Some of our business partners will be hostile, but... Zrextal's scales brightened slightly. But it is the right thing to do. Yeah, it is. Will you help me? Jimmy blinked. Help you how? With advice, with guidance, with... Zrextal gestured vaguely. With whatever wisdom a former military operative turned custodial engineer might have to offer. Kid, I'm flattered, but I'm not exactly guidance counselor material. Perhaps not, Zrextal agreed. But you are someone who understands that doing the right thing is more important than doing the easy thing. And that is exactly the kind of guidance I need. Jimmy considered this. The kid was serious, and he was taking on something that could ruin his life if it went wrong. But he was also trying to fix a system that had been broken for generations, and that took courage. All right, Jimmy said finally. I'll help, but I've got conditions. What conditions? First, you do this the right way. Legal, transparent, with proper oversight. No cutting corners, no vigilante justice, no dramatic gestures that make good headlines but don't actually fix anything. Agreed. Second, you accept that this is going to take time. Real reform doesn't happen overnight, and anyone who tells you different is trying to sell you something. Understood. Third, you remember that you're not doing this alone. There are people and organizations who've been fighting for workers' rights for decades. Listen to them, learn from them, and don't assume you know better just because you're young and idealistic. Zrextal nodded solemnly. I will remember. Good. Jimmy resumed packing his supplies. Now go get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and you've got work to do. Mr. O'Brien? Yeah? Thank you. For everything. Don't thank me yet, kid. Thank me when you've actually accomplished something. After Zrextal left, Jimmy finished cleaning up and made his way back to his quarters. A small apartment on the residential level that he'd been assigned when he took the job. It wasn't much, but it was comfortable and quiet, and it gave him a place to think. Jimmy poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at his kitchen table to review the day's events. 3 years of careful anonymity blown in a single evening. His cover was compromised, his identity was known, and his peaceful existence as just another working guy was probably over. And somehow he felt better than he had in years. Maybe Martinez was right. Maybe retirement did suit him. Not because he'd stopped caring about making a difference, but because he'd found a way to make a difference that didn't require him to compromise his principles or sacrifice his humanity. Jimmy's comm unit buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the sender ID and smiled. It was from Kestra, the Andromedean student who'd thanked him earlier for the dormitory safety report. Mr. O'Brien, I heard what happened tonight. Thank you for watching over us. We are lucky to have you. K. Jimmy typed back. Just doing my job. Stay safe. The response came immediately. We all have jobs, Mr. O'Brien. Not all of us do them with such dedication. Sleep well. Jimmy set down his comm unit and finished his coffee. Tomorrow he'd go back to work. He'd mop floors and empty trash cans and listen to lectures about advanced physics. Students would treat him like furniture. Professors would ignore him, and administrators would assume he was too simple to understand their important conversations. But he'd also be watching, listening, learning, and when the next crisis came, because there was always a next crisis, he'd be ready. Jimmy O'Brien, former Ghost Protocol operative, current custodial engineer, and unofficial guardian of the galaxy's most prestigious interspecies academy. It wasn't the career he'd planned, but it was the career he'd chosen. And for the first time in 3 years, it felt like exactly where he belonged. Jimmy was getting ready for bed when his comm unit buzzed one more time. This message was from an unfamiliar sender, but the encryption pattern was one he recognized, high-level military intelligence. He opened the message and read, Mr. O'Brien, your actions tonight prevented what could have been a significant diplomatic incident. Several governments are in your debt, though they will never acknowledge it publicly. Well done. Should you ever reconsider your retirement, many opportunities await. Admiral Victoria Kane, Ghost Protocol Command. Jimmy smiled and deleted the message. Then he turned off his comm unit, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Outside his window, Kepler Station continued its endless orbit around the distant star, carrying its cargo of dreamers and scholars and future leaders toward whatever tomorrow might bring. And somewhere in the Academy's service levels, surveillance systems monitored empty hallways, while automated cleaning robots finished the work that Jimmy had started. But in the dormitories, young people from across the galaxy slept safely in their beds, protected by security systems that actually worked and watched over by a guardian they'd never see coming. It was honest work. It was important work. And Jimmy O'Brien, former weapon of war, current keeper of the peace, slept better than he had in years. Epilogue. 6 months later. Jimmy!
The quantum flux inhibitor in Lab 7 is making that noise again. Jimmy looked up from his weekly security report, a document that Dr. Blackwood had started requiring after the kidnapping incident, though she was still the only person who knew he was writing it, and sighed dramatically.
What kind of noise, Professor Veltar? The kind that suggests imminent catastrophic failure and possible dimensional rupture. Jimmy grabbed his toolbox and headed toward Lab 7, where Professor Veltar, who had managed to avoid scandal by voluntarily entering a rehabilitation program and making some significant changes to his research ethics, was standing next to a piece of equipment that was indeed making concerning noises. "Step back, Prof," Jimmy said, pulling on his work gloves. "Let me take a look." It took him about 10 minutes to identify and fix the problem. A loose coupling in the dimensional stabilizer array that any competent engineer could have repaired. But the Academy's maintenance staff had never been trained on quantum equipment, and Professor Veltar, like most theoretical physicists, couldn't change a light bulb without accidentally creating a small black hole. "There you go," Jimmy said, powering the equipment back up. "Should run smooth as silk now." "Remarkable," Professor Veltar said, watching the readings return to normal. "Mr. O'Brien, have you ever considered a career in quantum engineering?" "Nah," Jimmy replied, packing up his tools. "I like my current job too much," which was true. Over the past 6 months, Jimmy had settled into a routine that balanced his official duties as custodial engineer with his unofficial role as security consultant. The academy was safer, the students were happier, and the staff had started treating him less like furniture and more like a valued member of the community. "Doctor." Blackwood had formalized their arrangement, creating a new position called Facilities Security Coordinator that gave Jimmy the authority to investigate and address safety concerns without having to explain why a janitor knew so much about advanced security systems. Zrekstal had made good on his promise to reform his family's business practices. Working with the Centauri Labor Alliance, he'd exposed a network of labor violations that extended across 3-star systems. The resulting legal action had cost the Vorthak trading empire millions of credits in fines and penalties, but it had also led to significant improvements in working conditions for thousands of employees. More importantly, it had established Zrekstal as a leader in the growing movement for corporate accountability. He was still just a student, but he was also becoming a voice for reform that other young people across the galaxy were starting to listen to. Kestra had started a student organization focused on campus safety and security awareness. What had begun as a response to the kidnapping attempt had evolved into a comprehensive program that taught students how to recognize and respond to various threats. Jimmy had been invited to give a guest lecture on personal security in an interspecies environment, which had been both terrifying and oddly rewarding. Dr. Reed, meanwhile, was serving a 25-year sentence in a federal maximum security facility after his cooperation had led to the arrest of 17 other members of the slave trading network. The information he'd provided had also helped authorities identify and rescue dozens of victims, including several children who'd been missing for years. The Academy had implemented new security protocols based on Jimmy's recommendations, including improved background checks for staff, enhanced monitoring of communication systems, and regular security audits conducted by independent contractors with appropriate clearances. In other words, the place was becoming exactly what it claimed to be: a safe environment where young people from across the galaxy could learn and grow without having to worry about being kidnapped by slave traders or exploited by corrupt administrators. Jimmy was finishing his afternoon rounds when his comm unit buzzed with a message from Dr. Blackwood. "My office, when you have a moment." "Nothing urgent, just want to discuss something." Jimmy made his way to the administrative wing, where Dr. Blackwood was waiting with coffee and what looked like official paperwork. "Hey Doc, what's up?" "Sit down, Jimmy. I've got something to show you." She handed him a formal-looking document with the Academy's seal at the top. Jimmy scanned it quickly, then looked up at her with raised eyebrows. "You're recommending me for the Distinguished Service Award?" "Among other things." Dr. Blackwood smiled. "The Board of Directors has also approved a significant budget increase for campus security, including funding for additional staff and equipment. They want to know if you'd be interested in heading up the new department." Jimmy considered this. What would that involve? Supervising a team of security professionals, developing comprehensive safety protocols, liaising with local law enforcement and military agencies, and generally making sure that what happened 6 months ago never happens again. Sounds like a lot of meetings. Probably, yes. And paperwork. Almost certainly. And dealing with bureaucrats and administrators and people who think they know better than the guy who actually does the work. Without question. Jimmy was quiet for a moment, thinking it over. It was a good offer. More money, more authority, more respect. It was the kind of career advancement that most people would jump at. Thanks, but no thanks, he said finally. Dr. Blackwood blinked. Really? Really. I like what I'm doing now. I like being the guy who notices things, who keeps an eye on the details, who makes sure the important stuff doesn't fall through the cracks. Jimmy handed the paperwork back to her. You put me in charge of a department, and I become just another administrator. I'd rather stay where I can actually make a difference. Are you sure? This is a significant opportunity. I'm sure. Jimmy stood up and headed for the door. But thanks for thinking of me. Jimmy? Yeah? What if I told you that the new security department would be structured specifically to avoid the usual bureaucratic problems? What if I told you that you'd have complete operational autonomy and direct access to academy leadership? Jimmy paused. I'd say that sounds too good to be true. And what if I told you that the board specifically requested that you be given whatever resources and authority you need to do the job, right? I'd say the board must have been very impressed by what happened 6 months ago. They were, more than you know. Dr. Blackwood leaned back in her chair. Jimmy, the academy gets funding from governments and corporations across the galaxy. Some of those governments have been very concerned about security issues at interspecies institutions, and some of those corporations have been reconsidering their support for educational programs. And now they're not? And now they're not. Because they know that the academy has someone watching over it who actually knows what he's doing. Jimmy considered this. It was flattering, and it was probably true. But it was also a lot of responsibility. Can I think about it? Of course. Take all the time you need. Jimmy left Dr. Blackwood's office and made his way back to the academic wing, where students were settling in for evening study sessions. The hallways were full of the kind of quiet energy that came from young minds wrestling with big ideas. He was passing one of the study lounges when he overheard a conversation that made him stop. I still can't believe it, one student was saying. 6 months ago, we thought Mr. O'Brien was just the janitor. Now we know he's some kind of super soldier, another student replied. My dad says Ghost Protocol operatives are basically legends. My sister heard he once single-handedly stopped a pirate fleet from attacking a civilian transport, a third voice added. Jimmy smiled and kept walking. The rumors about his past had grown increasingly elaborate over the past few months. According to various students, he'd been everything from a space marine to a diplomat to a time traveler from the future. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than any of the stories they told. He was just a guy who'd learned some useful skills and decided to use them to help people. Everything else was just details. Jimmy was almost back to his supply closet when he encountered Zrextal, who was carrying what looked like legal documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd been dealing with lawyers all day. Hey kid, how's the corporate reform business? Exhausting, Zrextal replied. But productive. We have reached an agreement with the labor unions on new safety standards, and my father has finally agreed to allow independent inspections of all our facilities. That's great news. Yes, it is, and I wanted to thank you again for your guidance. I could not have navigated this process without your advice. Jimmy waved off the thanks. You did the hard work, kid. I just pointed you in the right direction. Perhaps, but direction matters. Zrextal paused. Mr. O'Brien, may I ask you something? Sure. Are you happy? Jimmy blinked. Come again? Are you happy? With your life? With your work? With your choices? Zrextal's scales had shifted to a thoughtful blue. I have been wondering about this, because you seem to be someone who could do anything, be anything, yet you choose to remain here, in a job that most people would consider beneath your capabilities. It was a good question, and one that Jimmy had been asking himself more often lately. Yeah, he said finally, I am happy. Maybe for the first time in my adult life. Why? Because I'm doing work that matters, with people I care about, in a place that feels like home. Jimmy shrugged. Turns out that's more important than money or prestige or whatever else people think success looks like. Zrextal nodded slowly. That is wisdom, Mr. O'Brien. Nah, kid, that's just common sense. After Zrextal left, Jimmy made his way back to his supply closet and settled in to finish his daily reports. Outside, Kepler Station continued its endless orbit, carrying its precious cargo of dreams and ambitions through the vast darkness of space. Jimmy pulled up his comm unit and composed a message to Dr. Blackwood. Doc, I've thought about your offer. I'll take the job, but with conditions. I want to keep my current duties as well as the new ones. I want to stay involved in the day-to-day operations, not just the big picture stuff. And I want it understood that I work for the students and faculty first, the academy second, and everyone else not at all. If that works for you, we have a deal. Jimmy. The response came back within minutes. Jimmy, those aren't conditions. They're exactly what we hoped you'd say. Welcome to your new job, Mr. Director of Campus Security. Try not to let it go to your head. Dr. Blackwood. Jimmy smiled and powered down his equipment. Tomorrow, he'd start learning how to be a director while still being a custodial engineer. He'd figure out how to supervise a security department while still keeping an eye on the small details that made the difference between safety and disaster. It wouldn't be easy, but then again, nothing worthwhile ever was. Jimmy O'Brien, former Ghost Protocol operative, current custodial engineer, future director of campus security, and permanent guardian of the dreams of tomorrow, turned off the lights and headed home. Behind him, the academy settled into its nighttime routine, watched over by systems that worked, protected by protocols that made sense, and inhabited by young people who could sleep safely in their beds. It was honest work. It was important work. And for the first time in his life, Jimmy O'Brien knew exactly where he belonged. The end.